Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Jean-Stéphane Gourévitch. Please sit. I will be standing. It's easier to moderate. My name is Jean-Stéphane Gourévitch. I'm an independent consultant working in fintech, strategy, public policy regulation. I'm a thought leader and sadly for you a speaker in conferences. I'm an independent conference organizer and I'm mentoring startups in fintech and insurtech, 10 startups in 9 different countries. We are going to talk about an important subject. I know it's almost the lunch, so we will try to make it very lively and try to make regulation interesting. But actually, regulation is really interesting, and it's very important because regulation can open markets or block the development of markets. So, without further ado, I will give the floor to each of our speakers to briefly introduce yourselves, starting with Malwina.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Malwina M.Bonder. I have I'm wearing 2 hats today. My first role is that I'm a lawyer in global law firm DLA Piper. My second role is that of an expert on a working committee supporting Polish government to implement cashless paperless program.
John?
Yes, hi, I'm J.Soberg. I'm an early stage venture capitalist and I focus on fintech. I'm based in Silicon Valley, but I invest all over the world. In Eastern Europe, at least, and in Poland, I'm probably best known for my investment in Creditech, where I was the first board member there. I look at a bunch of different things across a lot of different regulatory frameworks, so I probably have a little of a unique perspective there.
Thank you. Marcin.
Okay, so I'm M.Truszel. I'm founder and CEO of Kontomatik, and it's a bank account information services provider. And we started in 2009 as a Kontomish.pl. It was Polish personal finance management application. And for this personal management application, we needed access to bank accounts. And in 2012, it appeared that our B2B product is actually our core product. And in 2014, we were acquired by Creditech Holding.
Thank you. So we are going to have 2 parts in this discussion. The first part is really try to understand how some regulation, and this is a good segue with what my good friend Dere was talking about. Our regulation can help develop new markets, new products, and how it can be the basis for some commercial opportunities. And in the second part of the discussion, we are going to talk about the way regulators can interact with innovators, can have a role in the innovation ecosystem, and we are going to talk about the regulatory sandboxes and so on. So maybe to start with you, Malwina, what do you think are the key developing regulation in the field of fintech, and how do you feel they are impacting either positively or negatively the market and new product development? And I think you will probably focus a bit on the PSD, the famous PSD2. So I give you the floor for a couple of minutes. Tell us what's your vision about that.
Well, actually answer the question whether the regulation can help the market grow or they hinder the market. It actually, I know that lawyers are especially note of this phrase, but it really depends on the regulation. There are regulations which open new opportunities that help the market grow, and while the other hinder business. I think that the most important thing is that the regulation need to be fair and balanced, just to encourage new companies to create new solutions, but also to ensure appropriate level of customer protection. I think that the lack of regulation is not a good idea. It's not a good solution because it may make the companies to start a business in difficult way. For example, representative of Bitcoin companies claim that lack of clear regulation, they are not helping them to start a business, and some of them moved their business to UK, encouraged by clear tax regulations.
Yeah, well, that could change with Brexit, but that's another issue. But let's stay on that for a minute, because one of the growing discussion in the UK, PSD2, for instance, and for those who don't know what is the PSD2, it's the new regulation that is bringing a new layer and a new set of regulations for payment companies, but it has a much broader impact than only payments. And one big part of this directive is around the concept of open APIs and the obligation for banks to give access to new players through APIs. This is generally considered as a really important progress, but a lot of discussions are taking place at the moment on the issues of authentication, dual authentication, and the debate with the new standards that the European Banking Agency is trying to promote that could actually limit the development of new payment ecosystem. What's your opinion? Do you have an opinion on that as a lawyer, or how do you feel the problems, the constraints?
Well, actually, first of all, open banking, it sounds great, but it also brings challenge in case of security. Well, actually, I think it brings new opportunities for the market, as using common standard for new startups. Right now, today, if you want to create, if you want to provide payment initiation services, mostly is based on separate agreement with different banks, and all of them actually have different standard of communication, so you need to adjust your solution to those standards. Once PSD2 is implemented, banks need to communicate with they need to have a standard API and the standard of communication, and they also and it will be irrespective of the fact whether there is any agreement in place or not.
Okay. We'll come back to that, because in the UK you have a discussion about the way they try to solve this issue was to bring the industry together to discuss the standard for the APIs and actually anticipating the implementation of the regulation. But before giving you the floor, John, I think your experience of regulation impacting a startups is a little bit bruising. So I think it would be interesting for us to understand what happened to you a couple of months ago. And it gives a good feeling that regulation, yes, can also be hampering some developments. Marcin, could you tell us a bit about what happened to you with the data scrapping?
Yeah, so, well, in 2012, as I said, we started offer our services B2P solution, and most innovative Polish banks like Alior Bank or Idea Bank started to use our solution for their onboarding systems, and it worked really well. But after some time, Polish banking authority convinced those banks to stop using our technology, such technology, and suddenly nearly whole market disappeared for us, and just because of regulation. So it forced us to be more diversified. We opened new markets, and we started also to cooperate with non-regulated financial institutions, and also created additional products. And now we are present on 10 different markets, 10 different countries. And
so it was a good thing in a way. The fact that they force you to change your business model helped you develop in 10 different countries in a way. So I imagine
at the end,
was bruising.
It turned well, but yes.
So you had the good and the bad aspects of regulation. One of the issues you were facing, of course, was linked to a decision from the European Court of Justice in 2014 in a case involving Ryanair on data scraping, and this case limited in a large extent what companies can do with scrapping. John, as an investor, how do you feel that regulation is giving incentives to investors like you to invest in startup, and how do you feel regulation can really trigger some form of innovation and some form of growth on the market? What's your opinion? And I think it's particularly interesting because you are operating in different regions in the world, so I'd love to have your perspective on that.
So usually I don't think of regulation as generating opportunities as much as, directing the way people can go. So there are some exceptions. I think when the Jobs Act in the U.S. passed, we saw a huge uptick in crowdfunding and some things like that. So we have seen some cases where regulation and pretty big change in regulation has actually made a huge impact in terms of opportunity. For me, though, more generally what I do is I look at what are the constraints that are put in place based on the regulation, and do the companies have the ability to execute in a market that they're going after given the regulations, and do they understand what that means for their business? Obviously, there's these things can change, as we've seen. In the U.S., we may not have any regulations after Trump came in, so
you might not have a country after Trump.
I'm not sure. So maybe it'll be the Wild Wild West again, and we. But I think you always have to be very, very mindful when you're doing fintech investing of how you fit, what you're trying to do, where it fits within the regulatory framework, and does the team understand how that works?
I think, again, what you are saying is very interesting, and it's funny because the first word you used was constraints, and I think I'm maybe a more optimistic person than you are with regard to regulation, because I think personally, based on my experience, regulation can also open opportunities. And one of the things, as Dele was explaining a couple of minutes ago, as you know, data is really the core of all these developments in fintech and insurtech at the moment. And increasingly, the startups I'm working with are realizing that they can use regulation on data, for instance, to actually develop products, not just consider regulation as a compliance issue, but also as a commercial opportunity, and take support of that to develop a new relationship with their clients who would like to have more transparency on data, to know better how their data are going to be used, etc. So it can also really be an opportunity. And again, we're talking about the PSD. I think, Malvina, maybe if you can tell us a word about what do you feel is particularly important in the PSD? Well, one of the things, in addition to the API, is the two markets. It's creating the two new markets. The directive creates the AISPs. I can't say this word, it's horrible. PISPs and AISPs, account integrator service providers and payment integrator service providers. These people will have a really important role. How do you feel that this could help the market develop as a lawyer? How do you talk about that with your clients, for instance? What do you advise them with regard to this part of the PSD2?
PSD2 was proposed to further promote the objective of the original PSD, but also to bring it up to date in the light of significant technological revolution, and also to regulate the services that are not regulated right now. So I think that that's the impact, because it provides appropriate level of customer protection in case of those services that were not regulated, and I think that's the main influence on the market.
John, do you feel that this? I mean, if you are familiar with this, roughly with this regulation, how do you think it could impact the development of new startups, new players, like people, maybe just before, so that you understand what the PSD2 is actually doing in addition to the API and changing some of the rules on consumer protection, etc. One really important element is that new payment integration service providers and account integration service providers will be able to connect directly to the bank account of the payee once they have the consent of the payee, and the bank will have to give access. They cannot refuse access based on the PSD2. So these new markets that are created, how do you see the opportunities in terms of investment, and do you think it's a potentially worthy market for an investor like you?
Oh yeah, I do think, anytime you have a big regulatory change, it usually does create some opportunities. So I would definitely agree. What I see with this is oversimplifying, which is what VCs do, is that this is forcing some of the old school, banks that are difficult to work with, to come a little bit further. Now, I guess I would take a somewhat pragmatic approach and say that I know there's some banks that have been created kind of ground up that would do this anyway. So, what this is doing is, like you said, it's forcing the ability to access a customer's account in a bank that otherwise might not have done that. So it does definitely open up the opportunity for companies to give a broader array of services. So I think it's, in that case, it's very good. Anytime and it doesn't have to be driven by regulation, but when you adopt standards, when you see industries adopt standards, that can often be hugely helpful. Payments is a huge pain. Even today, we've seen, tons and tons of new startups and great startups in the payments industry. But if you want to be a global provider and you want to do payments in multiple different countries, guess what? You have to deal with that all over the place. And it's not standard, and it's not easy, and it's a huge pain. So even with some of the regulatory improvements, it still hasn't become, it's not easy. So there's a lot of opportunities still.
Marcin, if I was asking you what is your shopping list in terms of what you would like the regulators, and I'm saying the regulators because it's not necessarily only the financial service or the banking authority, regulator, it can be also the data protection, it can be the competition authority. What would be your shopping list as a startup to help you continue growing? What would you like from regulators?
From regulators, first of all, I would like to have time from their side that they could talk with me and speak and listen and what are the needs, because sometimes it's hard to talk with regulators. But I think that currently PSD2 it's a great regulation in the spirit. But the problem is that there are several steps of implementation. First, IBA, RTS, then local implementation, and then implementation of API in bank. And on each of those steps, this whole great idea of data openness could be a little bit changed and
well, that's a perfect segue for the second part of the discussion around effectively how regulators can engage. In the UK, as I was telling you, in order, the government before Brexit decided to anticipate the implementation of the PSD2, particularly on the API aspect. So they created a group to start talking between the banks, the startups, the governments about the standard for these open APIs. And it worked quite well because they have progressed now quite far away in the way these APIs will be created and how they are going to be used. The problem really today is the discussion is bogged down with regard to security and particularly the dual authentication aspects of the security part. But is there anything similar in Poland, for instance? Is the regulator engaging with the startups, the banks, to try to create an industry forum on open APIs? Is there anything, Malwina?
Well, actually, Association of Polish Bank, I know that they are working on Polish API. So the
what
works.
does Polish API mean?
It means Polish standard of communication. So between the banks and the service providers, but they want to.
Isn't it a bit alarming that they are not implementing APIs that are the PSD2 APIs
Yeah,
rather
they
than
will.
the Polish APIs?
They will, but you know that Polish banks are really innovative, and actually they are fintech companies for me, and so they started work on that, but they are taking into consideration the requirements of PSD2 and RTS.
One of the issues you had in the UK about APIs, but also others, is that banks for a long time have been talking between them, but they have not involved other parts of the ecosystem. For instance, the mobile operators. And I know in Poland, mobile operators have an important role with regard to mobile banking. They are cooperating with banks, developing mobile banking solutions that works quite well. Are they involved in the discussions in Poland or not really, mobile operators?
I don't have information about it.
Okay.
But I think that Polish API is mostly discussion between banks. For example, we were not invited to this.
Okay, so what you are saying is that in a way, banks are talking between them about things they are supposed to create that are open and where the market and startups and others will have a role. They don't involve you in the discussion?
No.
Interesting. I think that could warrant some investigation from the competition authorities in the future, but that's an interesting development. John, how do you see the, as you know, in the UK, one of the very interesting development is the engagement from the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the FCA, which is the regulator, with something called the regulatory sandbox, which is really a kind of trial solution that allows startups to start a dialogue with the regulator and see what will be the problem in the future, if any, with regard to compliance. This is kind of spreading now around the world like a wildfire. What's your vision of that? Do you think it's something useful? Does it deliver results?
I think it's very useful. I think if you compare different ecosystems around the world, the UK and the engagement of the FCA has helped in some ways to drive, London as one of the real hubs of fintech innovation. There's a couple around the world, but I think the engagement of the regulator actually is really attractive for startups in order to make sure that they are understanding and are able to work within that. In the US, we really don't have that. And then to compound matters in the US, you also, besides having to deal with the federal, you get to deal with each state. So it's regulatory-wise, in some ways, it's way more attractive to be outside the US than inside the US as a fintech company. On the flip side, if you're able to work within the regulatory frameworks, you actually have a competitive advantage. So as you were saying before, sometimes the regulators actually create opportunities, or they create barriers to competition that can be, to a startup's advantage. But bottom line is, I think we are seeing that sandbox type of approach and that engagement be more common around the world. I think the BaFin has been doing more in Germany. I think, and you're seeing a lot more
in Asia, a lot. Singapore, Thailand, Hong Kong.
And in each example, you see that those startup communities are really thriving. So there's a really high correlation there.
I think in the UK, clearly it had an impact in terms of the discussion between the different parts of the ecosystem and really bringing innovation. But a number of people are saying that actually it raises a lot of issues also in terms of whether if the regulator is starting to create these sandboxes, how the regulator is going in the future will the regulator be objective enough to be a regulator and ensure compliance and enforce compliance? So there are some discussions about the risk for the regulator to being dragged and involved too much rather than be an objective watchdog. Marcin, how would you consider the possibility for a startup like you to be engaged with the regulators, to try your products? Do you think that it would be something that really helps for a company like yours?
Well, I'm quite skeptical to this, but I know that there's now an initiative also in Poland about sandbox in Polish banking authority, but it all looks good on paper, but it depends how it works then.
Malwina, do you want to?
Well,
What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a good idea to follow in the footsteps of innovation hub and financial hubs like UK, Singapore, Hong Kong, or Australia. But I think that in case of UK, it's rather PR thing then, because the scope is small, and I think that we need to think about a solution that will really help startups to understand the regulatory framework and I'm thinking about that it could be possible for the authority to create special department who will be able to review the solution proposed by startup companies. And to tell them what they should do to comply with the regulation. Another good solution, I think, it would be to prepare a template for internal documentation in respect of risk management, AML, or privacy and data protection. So I think that the authority can actively encourage companies, not only startups, but also market players to invest in innovative solutions and use the new technologies.
I think what's important with the sandbox is, based on my experience, some of the startups I'm mentoring actually have been accepted in the FCA regulatory sandbox selection that has just started a couple of weeks ago. And they are paired with major players like Aviva in the insurance sector or Lloyd's Banking Group. I think what's really important it's creating, beyond simply compliance, it's creating the opportunity to try to understand how a new product that you don't really necessarily understand at the beginning can interact with regulation. And this is where I think I'm not, if I may, I will respectfully disagree with you on that. I think it's actually very important because it's very preliminary in the process. It's not waiting the moment where the companies actually have developed the things. John,
And
do you want to?
Yeah, I want to. You know that one company, Bilon, is actually has Polish grounds.
Yeah.
It was qualified both by the FCA.
Absolutely. One of the companies I'm mentoring as actually part of his team in Poland too. I told you,
great.
Loot. John?
I guess I was going to say, I think, it's a start. I don't think there's very much risk that the regulator is going to, is going to be so helpful to the startups that they're not going to regulate. I think that's probably one of the lowest risks that you can probably assume in these scenarios. I think the dialogue though is very helpful. So, but I would like to see it open up to more. The sandboxes are nice, but even the fact that there's a selection process and only a certain group, you have to limit it obviously, otherwise it would be chaos. But on the flip side, I think that there's still a lot of room for growth there.
Another aspect I think which is important, and we'll finish on with this one, is the consistency of these different regulations, how they interact between them. And again, in the UK, interestingly enough, there was recently a new investigation on the banking industries by the Competition and Markets Authority, which is the competition regulator, that ended up with proposals that are very removed, much less interesting than what is actually discussed by the industry in the open APIs. So the way the different regulation, data protection, PSD2, competition law are interacting, and the way the regulators are actually working or not together, I think is quite an important element. Do you feel that there are some rooms for improvement, maybe in Poland, the way the different regulators work together? Marcin, what would you say about that?
I don't know.
Okay, that's a clear answer. Malwina, what do you think?
I think there's plenty of room for cooperation between the authorities to help to help investors and help startups and companies that are on the market.
John, a word about that?
I think the same as everyone. I think the more dialogue, the better.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we are almost at the end of this session, 26 seconds remaining. So we are probably going to close it. I would like you to please give a round of applause to the wonderful panel we had today. Thank you, Malwina, John, and Marcin. I hope it was interesting, and I'll give back the floor to the next panels or the next speaker. Thank you very much.